The title of my talk is up there, basically. Without further ado, I'll just get into. This is a flagship project that's running for the Council of Europe. It's called Competencies for Democratic Culture. Now, the project began actually in late 2013, and it's concluding in October 2017. Now, it's a hugely ambitious project. It's got a very wide scope, and I'm only going to have time in this presentation to really skate over the surface of the real content of the project. Essentially, what we're doing in the project is we are developing a new competence-based reference framework for citizenship education. And the project is very closely tied to what are called the three pillars of the Council of Europe. Now, as I go around and give talks about this project, I discover that very few people actually know what the Council of Europe is, and they have no idea what the three pillars of the Council of Europe are either. So let me just say a few words quickly about the Council of Europe. Council of Europe, it's an international organization that actually has 47 member states. It's completely separate from the European Union, and it's completely different from what's called the European Council. The European Council are the heads of state, heads of government of the EU member states. That's the European Council. I'm talking about the Council of Europe, which is completely different from the European Council. The Council of Europe has its headquarters in Strasbourg in France. These are the main headquarters. The logo is that. And basically, the Council of Europe predates the European Union. It was actually established in 1949 in the aftermath of World War II. And there was a fundamental overriding intention behind its foundation, and that was to try to ensure that totalitarianism could never arise again in Europe. The aims of the organization, therefore, were to promote and to protect human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, those three things. And those are what are known as the three pillars of the Council of Europe. And so the Council of Europe, it's fundamentally a values-based organization. Its fundamental values stem from human rights, democracy, and rule of law. Now, the most well-known international agreement that the Council of Europe has set up, it's the European Convention on Human Rights. It's often thought that this is an EU invention. It isn't. It's the Council of Europe. The most well-known agency of the Council of Europe is actually the European Court of Human Rights, which is responsible for legal judgments concerning the application of the Convention in the various member states. And this is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg as well. And this is the extent of the Council of Europe. I've got a colleague who says it stretches all the way from Vladivostok to Reykjavik. No, it doesn't. It stretches all the way from Vladivostok through the whole of Greenland, actually, is formally a part of the Council of Europe. It's an enormous organization covering a substantial area of the world, in fact. Okay, so coming back to the CDC project, the basic aim of the CDC project is to promote and strengthen democracy in Europe, essentially by harnessing the member states' education systems for this purpose. So it's tied, if you like, to the pillar of democracy primarily, but also the other pillars as well, as you'll see. So in the project, what we're doing, we're formulating very detailed recommendations on how formal education, and by this we mean everything ranging from preschool education all the way up to university level, higher education, how that system can be used to equip people with the competencies that they need for participating actively in democratic culture. So in order to achieve this goal, what we're doing is we're developing what's being called now a new reference framework of the competencies that young people need to acquire in order to participate effectively in democratic culture. And we're basically formulating detailed guidance for the European Ministries of Education on how the CDC framework can be used to develop suitable curricula, pedagogical methods and assessment tools for use in formal education that will equip young people with these competencies. And the primary audience, if you like, of the project up to this point in time has been the ministries of education across Europe in all the member states. Now, notice this term democratic culture. This appears in the title of the project, and we're using this term for a very deliberate reason. We're using it in order to emphasize the fact, right, democracy, obviously, it requires democratic institutions within a country, but what we're maintaining is that those institutions themselves can't function properly unless citizens hold democratic values and attitudes and are willing to engage in democratic practices. If you like, this is the lesson that's been learnt by the attempts to invade Middle Eastern countries, set up democratic systems in those countries where there is no democratic culture. The institutions do not work. We're maintaining that you need a democratic culture amongst citizens for the institutions themselves to work. So we're saying a functioning democracy, it requires, we want our citizens to have a commitment to democratic processes. We want them to have a willingness to express their own opinions, a willingness to listen to the opinions of other people, which may not always accord with their own, a commitment to decisions being made by majorities, a commitment to the protection of minorities and their rights, and a conviction that conflicts have to be resolved peacefully. These are the sorts of things, amongst others, that we mean by democratic culture. We want citizens to have these sorts of commitments and willingnesses. Now, the crucial importance of intercultural dialogue, this is really a second key assumption of the project. Democratic culture in culturally diverse societies, which is all European societies, they are all culturally diverse, that requires intercultural dialogue. And the reason for this is there's a fundamental principle of democracy, and that is that the people who are going to be affected by political decisions, they are entitled to, and they should be able to express their views to the people who are making those decisions, and the decision makers should be paying attention to the views of the people when they are making their decisions. Now, in a culturally diverse society, therefore you have to have intercultural dialogue, because that's precisely the means through which citizens can communicate their own views, their needs, their perspectives, their concerns, their aspirations, and so on, to other people who have different cultural affiliations from their own. This is what we mean by intercultural dialogue. It is talking across the so-called cultural boundaries. In other words, what we're saying is, in the case of culturally diverse societies, intercultural dialogue, we believe, is absolutely vital for democratic discussion and debate, and for enabling all citizens to contribute to political decision-making on an equal footing, irrespective of their specific cultural affiliations. So we're viewing intercultural dialogue as being absolutely crucial for democratic culture, and indeed for enabling democracy itself to function properly within European countries. Now, we have three components in this framework that we're developing. The first component is a conceptual model of the competencies that young people need to acquire if they are to become effective democratic citizens, basically, and participate in democratic culture and in intercultural dialogue. The second component of the framework is something that is called scaled descriptors for all of the competencies that are contained in the conceptual model. I'll come back to that later. I'll explain exactly what we mean by that. But scaled descriptors is the second component. And the third component is the guidance for ministries of education, but also for educational practitioners, on how the model and those descriptors can be used to inform curriculum development. It can be used to inform the design of appropriate pedagogical approaches, and how it can be used to design appropriate assessment methods that will support the teaching and learning of these competencies. So I'll take you through the three components in turn. I'll unpack each of them for you. So the first component of the framework is the conceptual model. Basically, this is a conceptual model of the competencies that people require to participate in democratic culture and intercultural dialogue. And these are essentially the competencies which we believe education needs to help young people to acquire so that they are properly equipped for their future lives as democratic citizens. Now, the process of developing the model, we went through an extensive process. We began by auditing all the existing conceptual schemes of democratic competence and intercultural competence being the competence that you need to participate in intercultural dialogue, effective and appropriate intercultural dialogue. And in total, 101 schemes were audited. And then we analysed those 101 schemes to find the constituent competencies which they contain. We then used a set of principled criteria to identify the core competencies that were contained across the 101 schemes. We then produced a first draft of the model, and this first draft of the model was then sent out in a major, large-scale international consultation that involved academic experts, it involved educational practitioners, and there were also policymakers and experts who were nominated by the education ministries of all the member states as well. And the bottom line is that the model that we developed received very strong endorsement in the consultation. However, of course, we received lots of valuable feedback in the consultation. We used that feedback to fine-tune and finalize the model, the competence model that we developed. So all of that took a considerable amount of time, and we ended up with a model that basically contains 20 competencies in total. So these are the competencies that we believe education systems need to equip young people with. The 20 competencies fall into 4 broad categories. First of all, there are values. Second of all, there are attitudes. Thirdly, there are skills. And fourthly, there are bodies of knowledge and critical understanding that people have to acquire. Values, we have a definition. Those of you who are aware of Shalom Schwartz's work on values, we drew very heavily on his framework, his conceptualization of values. Basically, values are general beliefs that individuals hold about the desirable goals that should be striven for in life. And these serve as guiding principles on how to act. And the most crucial characteristic of a value that it differentiates it from an attitude, for example, is that values have a normative, prescriptive quality to them. They indicate what ought to be done or thought across many different situations. And values basically offer standards or criteria for carrying out a whole load of things, for evaluating actions, for justifying opinions, for deciding between alternatives, planning behavior, and so on and so forth. So values have a lot of functions. Well, we identified 3 sets of values which we believe are necessary for democratic culture and intercultural dialogue. The first of these is valuing human dignity and human rights. The second is valuing cultural diversity, and the third is valuing democracy, justice, fairness, equality, and the rule of law, which is a big category, if you like, but essentially these are things to do with values about how you think society should be run. They're all to do with managing society and societal institutions, if you like. Attitudes, we went with a very standard psychology definition of attitudes as being an overall mental orientation which an individual will adopt towards someone or something. And attitudes traditionally are said to contain 4 components. There's a belief or opinion about the object of the attitude. There are emotions or feelings concerning that object as well. There's also an evaluation that's either positive or negative towards the object of the attitude. And there's a tendency also to behave in a particular way towards that object. Now, we identified 6 attitudes altogether as being required for democratic culture. First of all, there is openness, attitudinal openness to cultural otherness and openness to other beliefs, worldviews, and practices. Respect for those things as well, which is different from openness. civic mindedness, having a sense of civic mindedness, feeling a commitment, if you like, to the community, however you define that, of other people that you live within. Responsibility, self-efficacy, so the belief that you feel you can achieve goals in life and you can negotiate obstacles and so on in order to achieve those goals. And something called tolerance of ambiguity, which is a construct within psychology, which is basically the ability to accept that issues and problems may not always have a single clear-cut solution, that viewed from different perspectives, a social issue might have different solutions, and being willing to tolerate that ambiguity, that there isn't necessarily a clear-cut answer. The skills, basically, we had a definition of skills as complex, well-organized patterns of either thinking or behavior in an adaptive manner in order to achieve a particular end or goal. And there are 8 skills that we identified as well. One, as education people, people in higher education in this room, autonomous learning skills, which I think we're all determined to try to transmit to our students. Also, analytical and critical thinking skills. Skills of listening and observing, paying attention to other people and to what other people are saying. Empathy, actually understanding what might be in the minds of other people. Flexibility and adaptability as well. Linguistic, communicative, and plurilingual skills so that you can actually speak to other people and communicate your views and opinions to other people. Cooperation skills and conflict resolution skills, extremely important, where you've got a society in which there are conflicting points of view inherently within a democracy. Knowledge and critical understanding, our 4th category. Knowledge we basically defined as the body of information that a person has, whereas understanding we defined as the comprehension and appreciation of meanings. But we actually use the term critical understanding because for us, within democracy, within the context of democratic citizenship, if you like, we really want it to involve active reflection on and critical evaluation of what is being understood, rather than going in for automatic, habitual, reflexive, if you like, an unreflective interpretation of phenomena and events. Now, we identified 3 main forms of knowledge and critical understanding. One is knowledge and critical understanding of the self, of yourself, basically, understanding your own cultural position and where you're situated in relationship to larger societal debates. Knowledge and critical understanding of language and communication. If you're going to engage in intercultural dialogue, this actually requires very sophisticated linguistic and communicative knowledge and understanding. And then, okay, this is a sleight of hand. We are addressing education ministries. We were being told the whole time, oh, there's too much in your model. You know, you've got to cut it down. We can't cope with having so many things there. So he said, okay, we need knowledge and critical understanding of all of these things. If you are an active democratic citizen, let's call them knowledge and critical understanding of the world. And the ministries were delighted because we brought the number of competencies down to 20 from something like 28. But I will admit there is a sleight of hand that actually went on here. Okay, this is the diagram. This is being called now the CDC butterfly, which basically is in a single diagram trying to capture what competence, democratic and intercultural competence, is all about. It's all about the coordinated mobilization, deployment, orchestration of these values, attitudes, skills, and bodies of knowledge and critical understanding. This is what is actually required. And so this is a sort of encapsulation of the model. Now, each one of the things that is listed under the bullets here, there is an extensive explanation and discussion of what we mean by each one, and there is a very considerable unpacking of each one of these 20 bullet points in the publication of the model. This is the booklet that was published last year, and this is the web page from which you can actually download it. It's available as a free download. It's the project website that's up there. And this gives you a very detailed description and explanation of each one of those 20 competencies. Right, now let me move on to the second component of the framework, and that is the descriptors. Now, in addition to developing the model of competencies, we've also developed descriptors for all of the competencies in the model. Now, what we mean by a descriptor is basically a statement or a description of what a person is able to do if they have mastered a particular competence. They are, in other words, what some of you might know as indicators. These are, so if you have mastered empathy, these are the behaviors that you can engage in. If you have, I don't know, linguistic and communicative skills, these are the things that you can do. So it's actually spelling out in terms of concrete behavior what you can do if you've mastered a particular competence. Now, the really important thing is that we have basically formulated all of the descriptors using the language of learning outcomes. And because they're formulated as learning outcomes, they can therefore be used, obviously, for assessment purposes. Has an individual student mastered this competence? Well, here are descriptors that tell you what they should be doing if they've mastered it. But also, because they're learning outcomes, they can be used for curriculum development and pedagogical planning purposes as well. Now, the process of developing these descriptors, we went through a really extensive process. We first of all audited lots of different psychometric scales, research documents, and policy documents, and altogether we went through 98 different source documents, and we found basically items in those documents that we felt we could take out and turn into descriptors formulated using that language of learning outcomes. And at that initial stage, we formulated over 2,000, so basically 100 descriptors per competence. And then we subjected to these to a large battery of different tasks. And these tasks, we had the participation of over 3,000 teachers across Europe who rated the descriptors. No one teacher rated all 2,000, okay? They had subsets of them, but they rated them. They also performed various things that we take as evidence of validation that the descriptors have validity. And they also did things that enabled us to scale the descriptors to different levels of proficiency. And as a result of that process, we've come down to a bank of about 400 validated and highly rated descriptors. And from those, we've selected about 130, which are going to be called the key descriptors. Again, this is to meet the needs of the ministries. The ministries said we want, the rough ballpark figure, you know, between no more than between 100 and 150. And so we've boiled them down to 130 key descriptors. And the data that we collected, we used to scale the descriptors to different levels of proficiency. And with the data that we collected, we were able to scale them to 3 different levels. So some descriptors indicate if you can do these things, then you've got a basic level of proficiency. But if you can do these things, you're actually at an intermediate level. And if you can do these things, that really is an advanced level of proficiency. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. So skills of listening and observing. The basic level of proficiency listens attentively to other people and listens carefully to differing opinions. Okay, you can see there is a level of competence there. You have a basic level of competence in that competence, basically. An intermediate level of proficiency, you'll see, cranked up slightly higher. So can listen effectively in order to decipher another person's meanings and intentions. So this is more than at the basic level. Watches speakers' gestures and general body language to help himself, herself, to figure out the meaning of what they are saying. More advanced as well. But then the actual advanced level pays attention to what other people imply but do not say. That came out as a still higher level of proficiency. Or, and this is coming into an intercultural one if you like, notices how people with other cultural affiliations react in different ways to the same situation. Right. Time is passing, so I'll skip through empathy, but we've basically got scaled descriptors for all 20 competencies in the model. Let me move on to the third component of the framework, the guidance documents that we've written. So we're currently writing, we're just finishing off the work on these guidance documents, which explain how the model and the descriptors can be used in formal education. Now, what we're doing, we're writing documents on how the framework can be used for curriculum development, the pedagogical methods that are most appropriate for the teaching and learning of the 20 competencies, how the framework can be used for assessing students, also how to apply the framework using a whole school approach or a whole institution approach when it comes to higher education in order to foster the development of the 20 competencies, and how teacher education and training needs to be adapted in order to support the use of the framework in national education systems. Again, that's actually targeted at the higher education section, the sector as a document. Now, in addition, next year we're going to start work on 2 new documents that we've already decided. One is how to use the framework in higher education. We've got higher education specialists on the expert group, and higher education has always been there from the outset as one of the targets, and how to use the CDC framework in vocational education and training, which also has been neglected up to this point in time. And we're currently discussing what else we should be working on over the next 2 years. We've got funding extension for another 2 years of the project up to the end of 2019. So let me come back to one of the themes of this conference, global citizenship. And how does this framework relate to global citizenship? Well, my argument, and I've made this argument in many contexts, and that is that the CDC model, it's inherently a model of global citizenship, not just democratic citizenship, but global citizenship. And this is partly because of the values which are contained in the model. Now, there are 2 sets of values that I think are especially important here. First of all, we have placed, and in discussions of some of the details of the model, actually, I personally place the valuing of human dignity and human rights at the very heart of the competence model. For me personally, this is the starting point. I actually believe you can unpack a lot of the other competencies from this as your starting point. In other words, what we're saying in this model by putting valuing human dignity and human rights there at the heart of it, we're saying that a competent democratic citizen is someone who believes that every individual human being, irrespective of their specific cultural affiliations, and I should say location in the world as well, their global position, is of equal worth, has equal dignity, is entitled to exactly the same set of human rights, and ought to be treated accordingly. Second, we've also, if you remember, placed the valuing of cultural diversity at the heart of the model as well. That's the second value. In other words, we're proposing that a competent democratic citizen is someone who believes that other cultural affiliations, cultural variability and diversity, and pluralism of perspectives, views, and practices ought to be positively regarded and appreciated, and in fact as viewed as an asset to society. And our claim is that without those 2 values, valuing human dignity and valuing human rights and valuing cultural diversity, an individual can't be considered to be democratically and interculturally competent. In other words, actually, what this means, if you think about it, is that the CDC model is a model of the competencies that are required for global citizenship. The perspective of global citizenship, there's lots of writings out there about global citizenship, and the key feature in all of these writings, whether they come from academics or whether they come from organizations like Oxfam or from the United Nations or UNESCO, they all emphasize that global citizenship, a key feature is the need for people to view themselves as citizens of a world community based on common human values and human dignity, who respect other people's cultural affiliations. That's a key feature of global citizenship, and that is a key feature within the CDC model. Now, in addition to these values, I think the CDC framework is a framework of the competencies that are required for global citizenship because it also incorporates something that I didn't draw your attention to, especially when I put up the butterfly, but basically incorporated in there is knowledge and critical understanding of economies, the environment, and sustainability. Now, if you download the model, the description of the model document that I put the web link up for before, you'll see this explained and unpacked, and some of the things that it's unpacked into, it includes knowledge and critical understanding of, for example, the environmental interdependence of the global community. This is one of the things we mean. Global environmental challenges, the economic interdependence of the global community, the impact that personal choices, political actions, and patterns of consumption that you engage in your locale will actually have effects, can actually have effects in other parts of the world. The need for responsible consumption in order to ensure sustainability, and the ethical issues associated with globalization. All of these things are incorporated very explicitly within the model, and all of those things are in both the UNESCO and the United Nations documents on global citizenship. These are all core elements of what these organizations mean by global citizenship, and they are there in the CDC model. Now, I'd just like to put up a note of caution. As I said right at the outset, the framework that we're developing, it is incredibly ambitious. It doesn't pretend to be a panacea for all the problems that we have at the moment. You know, and this is because even if all citizens, hypothetical, even if every citizen had the most highly developed set of competencies, those competencies alone would not guarantee a culture of democracy and effective intercultural dialogue. Why not? Because a culture of democracy and intercultural dialogue, they depend not only on citizens' competencies, but also on the nature and the structure, the configuration of political and civil institutions. And we know this from research in political science. We know that depending upon how institutions are structured, you get very different patterns of citizenship, citizen participation as a direct consequence of the configuration of those institutions. So you need the right institutions as well. Culture of democracy and intercultural dialogue also depend absolutely crucially on the actions that are taken to, for example, deal with systematic patterns of discrimination and disadvantage. We all know that these are rampant throughout all European societies, let alone societies elsewhere in the world. There are also differentials in the allocation of resources within societies. Some people just do not have many material resources, and they're not able to participate because they don't have the time and the money and the access to information that you need in order to participate effectively. And also we know that positions of power and privilege, they are occupied by people from particular socioeconomic and educational backgrounds and, dare one say it, you know, gender backgrounds as well. White middle-aged men in European societies tend to occupy the positions of power as well. There are discrepancies there. And all of those, of course, will disempower minority groups in particular from participating in democratic and intercultural dialogue, irrespective of how competent those individuals actually are. Now, there is a large political process running that behind this entire project. We basically have been keeping the education ministries informed throughout the project, and the ministries have been inputting ideas to the project throughout its lifetime. The steering committee has expressed very strong support for the project since it began back in 2013. However, an unexpected spotlight fell on the project. Originally, we started this project, it was just purely an education project. But after it started, we got a lot of political attention, and this occurred in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January 2015. Immediately after these attacks, the Council of Europe drew up an action plan for combating extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism. And the CDC framework was actually made the centerpiece of this plan. And there's now a political expectation that the framework is going to be used by education systems to equip young people within European societies, not only with the competencies that they need for democratic culture and intercultural dialogue, but also with the competencies that they need to deal, for example, with online propaganda, radicalizing propaganda, analytical and critical thinking skills, to recognize hate speech in the news media and online, knowledge and critical understanding of media, and also to value human dignity, human rights, and democratic processes. So because of this, we're now also writing a further document which is going to be explaining very precisely how this framework can be used to combat radicalization leading to violent extremism and terrorism. Now, because of this high level of political attention on the project, we have presented the framework not just to senior policymakers within the education ministries, but actually to the education ministers of all the member states twice. Last year, there was a conference of the ministers of education in Brussels in April, and earlier this year, there was another in Cyprus, and the theme of the Cyprus conference was precisely securing democracy through education. And basically, the conferences, they were convened very specifically to showcase and explain this framework to the education ministers. And we've actually got political buy-in to the framework from the ministries. The final declarations from these conferences have welcomed and endorsed the framework, and they've actually requested the Council of Europe to help countries to examine and to implement the framework in their own national education systems. Now, the framework itself, it's going to be formally launched later this year in Prague at a meeting of the Prague Forum. It's an event that's organized by the Czech Ministry of Education. And that's going to be presented to the education ministries. And implementation, we haven't finished writing the documents yet, but such is the demand for this that 6 countries have already said, we are going to implement this. We don't know what is coming, but we're going to be implementing it. So we've got 6 countries already, and I've got ideas of which further countries are likely to come on board. Now, all of the framework documents are going to be available as free downloads from the project website early next year. I'm not quite sure when everything will be published. It's however long, the publications department takes to actually get everything done. Now, if you want further information on the project, this is the project website. I'll show it to you once again. And this is my homepage, which has some additional links on it that you won't find on the project webpage. And I'll just conclude, well, thank you very much indeed for being here, for staying to the end of today, a very hot day, and for listening throughout this presentation. Thank you very much indeed.